just as a quick reminder, I do have a fanart hashtag, so if you want to draw my avatar or any of my OCs, post it on Twitter or Instagram with the hashtag MirrorSamuraiFanart. This is the best way to guarantee that I'll be able to see what you create. Also yeah, for any of those who remember him from the last video, Krita's part of my avatar now! Okay, let's get going. So if you've watched literally any of my videos, you'll know what the mirror art style is. It's the way I draw, pretty much all of the time. And for a simple video idea, I figured that talking about my art process might be interesting, if you're a fan of this style. And if you've never watched any of my videos, I don't know, stick around! I've got a bunch of other Speedpaint videos on this channel. Oh, and by the way, before we get started, I draw using a drawing tablet connected to a computer, specifically a Huey on canvas. I don't remember the make. And my drawing program of choice is Krita. I think that's all the intro we need, so let's start the Speedpaint! Okay, we're going to start this art with the sketch. Like most artists, I begin with the sketch to give myself a reference for the line art later on. And because the sketch is just a reference and won't be in the final product, I can make it as messy as I want! This is great because it means I don't have to worry about the sketch being perfect, which helps to get through it quicker. Now this is a personal thing that I haven't seen other artists do, but whenever I'm drawing a human, I always bring up a pre-made mannequin that I've drawn myself, to use as a reference for scale and proportions. Because I'm a consistency freak. I do feel like this is a disadvantage though, because if I look too hard at the mannequin, I become too limited in the range of motion I want to attempt, making my poses more stiff and my art pieces more samey. I'm trying to get away from the stiff pose trapping, but to be fair I hardly ever draw action scenes, so that might be a good way to practice. Generally when sketching, I just use my regular pen that I use for line art, just at a higher thickness so that it stands out from the line art. I feel like using a different brush might distinguish the sketch better, but keeping the sketch lines clean makes them easier for me to reference. I always choose a standout colour for the sketch, since my line art is black and I want to be able to tell the two apart. Oftentimes, I'll pick the sketch colour based on what I'm drawing. Like with this piece, I made the sketch blue because the character's mostly blue. Oh, by the way, the character I'm drawing here is one of my OCs. More on him later. So my actual art style is very stylized, inspired by anime, but I guess it's actually more of a cartoony look. But at the end of the day, the whole point of this stylization is just to appeal to my personal preferences. The most stylized part of my style is definitely the head, which on humans I make twice as big as it should be, while keeping the rest of the proportions accurate, though generally on the thinner side. Except I only really do this on humanoid species, most animals get to keep the same head size. The other main stylized parts of my designs would be the face and hair. For the face, I make the eyes much bigger and more pronounced with vertical irises, and then make the nose smaller to balance it out. When I first started drawing digital art, I'd also make the mouth really small, but I've been trying to avoid that and draw my characters' mouths at a decent size. I think the ears are pretty to scale, but I make them a lot more rounded and less detailed, and tend to have them stick out more. And then the neck, of course, is much thinner than it is on a real human, and a fair bit shorter too. As for the hair, my main goal is to give it a lot more style. As someone who has ugly flat hair in real life and doesn't like it, I tend to compensate by giving stylized and pronounced anime hair to my characters. And most of the time, that manifests in giving the hair these big tufts or spikes, which add a lot more shape and substance to the head area. Even when I'm drawing long and straight hair, I'll still add some splits and tufts along the way to give more visual intrigue. And for short hair, I often make it a bit longer at the back, so that the back of the hair can add more shapes around the head. And with that, we're all done with the sketch, so our next stop is the line art. Now, today I'm not too familiar with the ins and outs of art. There are a lot of different ways to handle line work. You can make the lines smooth, or you can make them intentionally rough. You can also vary the line weight so that lines are thicker at some points and thinner at others, and you can also change the line art colours to suit your tastes. Though in my case, I take things pretty simple with the line art, partly because I've yet to experiment with anything else. I've never tried sketchy lines before, and the whole line weight variation thing, I don't actually know how to enable it in Krita. Some of the pen icons imply that they do have the line weight variation, but I've tested them out and they all just give me smooth lines. It might be a thing with my drawing tablet or the tablet pen, or maybe there's some Krita setting that I'm missing. But with that aside, my line art's just simple, plain black lines. I like to keep the lines smooth and clean, so I try to draw each line in one long stroke rather than doing several short strokes. It's not that you should never do short strokes, that way you can get intentionally rough line art if that's the style you're going for. and if you're using a mouse instead of a drawing tablet, executing long strokes would be harder and more tedious, so don't be afraid to do the short strokes if that's the case. That's how I did all my line art pre-drawing tablet. Along with the single stroke lines, another thing I do to keep my lines clean is manual tapering. If the end of a line doesn't connect to any other lines, it looks a bit awkward if you leave the edge rounded, so I use the eraser to trim down the sides. That way, the tapered line fades more naturally. I also avoid using the transform tool to resize and rotate pieces of my art, because at least for me on Krita, that causes the transform space to become blurry and lower quality. Whenever I do use a transform tool, I copy what I've transformed onto a new layer and trace over it to keep the quality. Most of my line art is black, but I also use coloured outlines for details within the lines, such as seams, buttons, and patterns on clothes. I think that doing this helps separate the outlines from the details of your character, making the sections of their design clearer. As a side note, some artists will use multiple types of line art thickness on the same piece, using thicker lines for the outlines or rim of the character, and thinner lines for everything else. I've been meaning to try this for a while, but I've only ever done it for the Lumity redraw. Maybe I'll remember to try it again eventually. So now that the line art's done, we're on to applying the colours. When I'm applying my colours, I start by making a new layer and filling the entire canvas with a neutral colour, like the character's skin tone or something. Then, I go to the line art layer and click the magic wand tool outside the lines. After that, I'm able to easily erase all of the stuff in the colour layer that's outside the line art. Though this does leave me with a crust on the rim of the lines, which I have to go over and manually erase. But once the crust is all gone, I get to work recolouring sections of the design to bring the character's colour palette to life. Later on, I also add some blush to the cheeks and nose to give some more standout colour to the face. Given the size of the head, I didn't want it to look too plain. Speaking of the face, let's talk about how I draw eyes. I start by adding the colour on a separate layer, and then fill the top of the eye with dark gradient, followed by a light gradient below. After that, I make the pupils on another new layer, which are darker than the rest of the eye and have a dark, but not black outline. And to finish it up, I add a white shine to the top of the eye to contrast the dark background. The way I draw eyes currently is heavily influenced by the Pokemon art style. I've been considering altering the eyes to be more uniquely me, though I'll have to take some time to figure that out. So I think that's all I want to say with the colour, so I think I'll explain the character I'm drawing. Here's one of my OCs. His name is Kylan, and he's the main protagonist of one of my stories in progress. He's also my oldest OC, who I first created in 2015, though he's gone through a lot of redesigns, character revisions, and even a renaming in the 8 years since then. I want to talk about my OCs eventually, but I'm saving that for the future when my videos have more of a following. That's part of why I wanted to make this video, so you could still get some glimpses into my characters before that time. Okay, so the colours are all done, and now we get to talk about the shading. I actually have several main shading styles, and I tend to just decide which one I want to use on the spur of the moment. So for this video, I decided to do 4 different shading styles on the same piece. This is by no means all of my shading styles, but I think this gives a good range of what I do the most often nowadays. Starting with the most basic, the cell shading. Cell shading is the kind of shading you most often see in animated series, particularly anime, since it's generally quicker and easier to get right than soft shading. When deciding how to cell shade, it mostly comes down to 2 things, the colours and the layer mode. You see, by clicking this box at the top of the layers window, you can open up a list of layer styles that change how the colours are applied. Examples of layer styles that work well for shading are multiply, linear burn, and inverse subtract. Personally, I like to go for multiply, since it gives shadows that are more vibrant, but not too in your face. When applying the shading, it's important to have a good idea of a light source for the art, and place the shadows opposite to the light. In my case, I tend to assume that the light is to the top left of the character, so that the shadows fall on the lower right corners. Though sometimes I do experiment with this, like when the art has a visible source of light, or when I just have a fun idea in mind for the composition. Regardless of the light source, I also make sure to use shadows to cover anything that's to the back of the character. So if they're taking a step forward, ideally the back leg should be covered with shading. That way, the depth of the art becomes clearer. So after finishing with shell shading, we get to our second style, admittedly the one that's the least different. It's stealth shading, but with paler borders on the inside of the shadows, so that they transition more smoothly into the unshaded parts. This was inspired by the shading style of Pokemon, though of course the Pokemon style is a fair bit more painty. Still, I picked up this bordered cell shading from drawing in the Pokemon style, and I've started integrating it into my own art. It's a small change from regular cell shading, but I like the difference it makes. Now for our third shading style, we have soft shading. For the most part, I do this style by starting with cell shading and then using an airbrush eraser to blur out the edges. Though sometimes, when I'm feeling particularly tired, I instead do this shading in a more freestyle way. And by that, I mean I just go to town with the airbrush and erase parts where the shadows shouldn't fall. I think the soft shading might actually look slightly better this way. Not much more to say about the soft shading really. Which then leads us to the fourth and last shading style of this video, the painty shading. This is the same shading that I used in the Heartstopper video, where I pretty much came up with it spur of the moment. And up until now, that was the only time I'd done painty shadows, so it's still kind of new. For this shading, I changed up my brushes for once and used this purple brush. I think the purple brushes are meant to be watercolours. Anyway, this shading has a very unique look from the others, because instead of having blocky colour, I used a paintbrush to make short, zigzagging diagonal strokes. Both of the times I've done this shading, I actually started by doing cell shading to block out the areas I wanted to use the paintbrush in, though I think I can skip that step next time. I also add some zigzaggy blush with the paintbrush to reflect my usual face coloration and tie it in more with the shading style. Though admittedly, I think it made more sense with Nick and Charlie in the Heartstopper art, since they're boyfriends and they're hugging. Can you tell I never draw ship art? But anyway, that's all the shading styles finished, so now it's time to go back and add some lighting. I was eager to do this for the painterly shading, since around that time I'd been watching some videos of people drawing in the old Pokemon style, the one from the Game Boy era. It's a lot more painterly than modern Pokemon art, and something I noticed is that they kind of use white as a background colour, then paint the actual colours on top. So with that in mind, I knew I wanted to add some white with the lighting to really push that painterly feel of this shading style more. I also went back and added lighting to the other three shading styles. Normally I don't add lighting when I'm cell shading, but I usually do for the other two styles. Oh, and as a reminder, the 4 shading styles in this video aren't the only styles I do. Oftentimes when I'm drawing fan art of something, I'll try to replicate their shading style, partly to stay on brand, but also because I like experimenting with shading. To name one example, one time I drew fan art for Coraline, the graphic novel specifically, and I gave her the cell shading with hatching, a reference to the hatch shading that's used in the graphic novel itself. I think in the past I was insecure about my shading and kept struggling to find a style that was right for me. Nowadays, I'm still not sure if there's a best shading style for my style, but I enjoy doing all of these shading styles and I think they all work well. I think I'll continue to pick and choose depending on what fits the feel of what I'm going to draw. And hey, if I ever start taking commissions, a larger repertoire might have an appeal. But anyway, that should be the end of this shading and lighting. All that's left is the background. I've not really worked on scenes or area design for my OCs yet, so we're going with a simple visual backdrop. When making a background, I generally want to pick a colour that complements the character, but is also different enough so that they stand out. In Kylan's case, I went with a light blue background, because that's his theme colour, but I also added some darker blues and whites so that it wasn't too plain. I also created 2 versions of the same background, one with airbrushes and one with paint strokes, and altered their opacity so I could make 4 different versions of the same background, one for each shading style. So the background's all finished, and that's where we reached the end of my process. So how about we take a look at the final results? Thanks so much for watching the Speedpaint through to the end. It means a lot to me, especially since this video is a bit more personal than most other stuff on this channel. And hey, speaking of personal, what do you think of Kylan? To those of you who want to draw fan art, I highly encourage it. Be sure to post fan art on Twitter or Instagram with the hashtag MirrorSamuraiFanArt until I'm certain to see it. Speaking of my Twitter and Instagram, be sure to follow me there so you can keep up on my art. Oh, and be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you want to keep up on my speed paints and ramblings. And be sure to comment down below, telling me which of these shading styles is your favourite. My next video is going to be returning to fan art, specifically for Sonic the Hedgehog, so keep an eye out for that. Stay hopeful, don't give up on your dreams, don't be afraid to experiment with how you draw, and I'll see you all next time.